Okay, we're going to very quickly go through and talk about Romanesque architecture. During the Dark Ages, or what we refer to as the Dark Ages or the early Middle Ages, there was a period of monotony. Death was very common, and comparative to the cultures we were talking about in the ancient civilizations, it was much less civilized. That is open for debate, of course, but the gross generalization stands as that. Churches tended to give people hope in a bleak existence, even if some of the content of this period of Christianity really did sort of deal with focusing on the afterlife and making sure that once you were finished with your good and pious life in this world, that you would be moving to the next. So therefore, churches needed to feel like this otherworldly place. And so the interiors tended to be a little bit more decorated, and they were meant to feel like a place that could let light in. We see in this particular church, this is Vézelay Abbey, and this is one of the abbeys, one of the churches that has all of these Romanesque arches. We can see this long barrel vault in the nave of the church. This area is called the nave, leading up to where the ceremonies would happen, much as we are familiar with modern churches. Inside churches, we see a lot of relief sculpture. They did not have as much emphasis on realism as we saw in Greek and Roman architecture. They were trying to portray stories and ideas a little bit more in the style of the Egyptians, if you want to think about it that way. You have differently sized people. You have non-realistic proportions of people. They're certainly more expressive than the Egyptians, but things in Romanesque art are far more flattened out and not at all trying to be what they actually are, but to try and get you to feel something about the saints or people that they're portraying. For instance, this portrays the ungodly people of the world. It is a depiction of the first Pentecostal mission to spread the word of God to all people of the world. The figure in the tympanum who have not received the word of God are depicted as not fully human. Some are shown with pig snouts, others are misshapen, several are depicted as dwarves. One pygmy in particular is depicted as mounting a horse with the assistance of a ladder. On the far right there's a man with elephantine ears, and in the center we see a man covered in feathers. The architect and artisans depicted the unbelievers as physically grotesque in order to provide a visual image of what they saw as non-believers' moral turpitude. And so this really ties into the Crusades, as you'll watch the video about, and the fact that as Christians of this period are coming in contact with other religions or other people, they are trying to assert their own values and religion and trying to spread that faith. The art, the wall frescoes and paintings, we can see the influence that Byzantine art had on the West. We can see the fact that there are halos, the fact that, again, we're no longer trying to portray people as how they actually look. They are flattened in a certain way. The artists still have a fair amount of capability. It's just there is no strong desire to make things look real or realistic, and that is slightly lost over time by not practicing it. I'm going to quickly run through some history here, maybe refresh your memory from things you've learned in the past. Just let this wash over you. I won't be quizzing you on this. This is just something to give you a little bit of background. The Carolingian Empire was collapsing. There was attacks from Vikings, Magyars, and Saracens. The central government vanished, law and order disappeared, and military might was needed. Various raiders, Vikings perhaps from Britain and France, were taking the worst damage. By the 9th century, plundering reduced, and many areas of Europe, depopulated and ruined, began to grow again. So there started to become more commerce, and town life began to revive, improvements in agriculture, and feudal monarchies strengthened. So this is how feudal monarchies existed. So you would have the king at the top, the lords underneath the king. So there were greater and lesser lords who all had knights. Those knights were supposed to protect the land so that the serfs and peasants could go ahead and continue to harvest and grow food, as well as to create cloth and clothing and whatnot. Serfs were essentially slaves. They were bound to the land of their liege lord. Peasants were slightly more free, but because of their poverty, they were fairly not free. War was generally against invaders, but it was also with other feudal lords. Don't forget that this time there wasn't a sense of country the way that we have now. We often talk about certain areas in context of the countries that we identify in the modern times. But at this time, there were really just sort of loosely combined countries, for lack of a better word. It was more like city-states, that you would have a kingdom, sure, and a king over a large area. But because of depopulation and illness, people were spread out, and so you really only knew the lord, or your knight who oversaw your little piece of land. Castles were built for protection. Wood was used for defense. By the 12th century, castles had become elaborate homes as well. It just took a long time for industry to bounce back. Here we see the influence of cresting and crenellation from the way back in Mesopotamia, carried through to some degree through the Roman Empire, but here we see cresting and crenellation on everything. Now, it's less decorative than what we saw in Mesopotamia, but still has the same function of making sure that there's protection for archers as they defend the walls and battlements of each castle. So in warfare, specifically, the stirrup was invented. This is something that was taken from some of the nomadic tribes in the Mid-East. The stirrup, so the thing about the stirrup is that without the stirrup, you can't be as mobile on a horse because it's a little bit more difficult to literally dig your heels in. And this is why men also wore heels, because it would be able to hold yourself into the stirrup a little better. The sword and lance were capable of shock combat. Armored knights were on horseback. There were years of training on horse and combat. Because of this, and because of how expensive their armor and their horse and everything else was, the knights became an elite professional fighting force. The knights often were protected by armor and ransomed. Feudalism had different local practices and customs. They originated in France and spread to Germany and northern Italy. The Normandy invasion of 1066 brought feudalism to Britain. In Germany, there were German dynasties. Otto I invaded Italy and had the Pope crown him the Holy Roman Emperor in 962. In 1273, dukes elected the first Habsburg. The Habsburgs become extremely influential throughout time, really sort of reaching to their pinnacle of influence and the end of their influence at the turn of the century, Vienna. Germany, turn of the 20th century Vienna. I guess I can't just say turn of the century anymore. Germany was a collection of semi-independent principalities instead of an empire. The Anglo-Saxon and Norman Britain, so in the 5th century, invaded, the Normans invaded England. The Anglo-Saxons converted to Christianity and settled down. The 9th century, the Danes, Vikings, the Vikings themselves, plunder and settle. The Anglo-Saxon king Alfred the Great halted halted their threat and created the United Kingdom. In 1066, the Duke of Normandy claimed the throne, and he is known as William the Conqueror. Again, just let this stuff wash over you. Maybe it rings some bells, maybe it doesn't. The defeated Henry II married Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was from the south of France. And the England and France battle over these claims for pretty much the rest of time. In the 1100s, the French kings increased wealth and power, and between 1337 and 1453, we had the 100 Years' War. So Romanesque itself begins in the 6th century and the 10th century. It's really characterized by the reemergence of building projects that have arches, vaults, and domes that were used in the Roman Empire, hence its name. So the 12th century, you get these illuminated manuscripts. So illuminated simply means that they are decorated in a specific way. Again, you can see here this artistic style of the fact that the people are not really proportionate, but it tells a story. Now, this kind of iconography would have been a little bit easier to sort of read and understand by the people who were seeing it on a daily basis. Every art is a vocabulary, but the more educated you become on this artistic period, if it interests you, the more you sort of start to read a little bit more into, here's a guy, he's been tied up, they're taking him somewhere, they sort of want to beat him, I wonder why. But I don't feel like this is particularly important for this class to get too deeply into that. If you ever go to Europe, you will see just a lot of medieval art. I mean, a ton. Let's talk a little bit about clothing. The West was heavily influenced by Byzantine garments, mostly because the Byzantine Empire at this point was still the sort of height of civilization left in the world. They felt fairly far away, but that sort of religious authority coming from the Byzantine emperors continued to influence the West. So you have, for women, a chemise, which is a loosely fitting linen garment. You would often have a under tunic, which would be floor length with close fitting sleeves, and an outer tunic, which is floor length with wide sleeves that allowed the under tunic to show. We saw this also in the garments of the Byzantine Empire. Men were wearing hose, stockings tied around the knee. Sorry, not men. Women would wear stockings tied around the knee, but so would men. They would wear open slippers and sometimes clogs, which would be wooden platforms that would help them raise their shoes out of the water, mud, or snow. Here's some images of what this looks like. Here's some German noblewoman and a housewife in the 12th century. So again, you can see these sleeves really start to get very long. And we can see that there's an outer tunic and then this under tunic underneath. And of course, this is a grand lady. As we talked about on the first day of class, what you wear depends on what you do for a living. If you are a great lady and you are going to sort of have a life of leisure and you're going to be able to, I don't know, play music and raise your children with hired help, then you don't necessarily, or you're going to sew, you're going to do all these activities that women at the time period did. You don't need a lot of mobility, so these long sleeves don't really get in your way, whereas the housewife, she does not have those sleeves because she needs to actually work. She needs to make cloth, she needs to wash things, she needs to perform laborious tasks. And so therefore, she may don some kind of sleeve if she could afford it, but probably not. Here's the Carolingian fashion period from 987 to 1270. You can sort of see this progression. We are I'll go back to my pointer. We are looking at the similar sort of wrappings that we've seen before. We start to get certain different kinds of headdresses specifically, but pretty similar with minor changes. Again, we're not going to get into the heavy details here. Women would wear circlets, which are essentially headbands. They would also wear jeweled belts called girdles. All these words come back and change over time. I put this in for fun. Here's a little paper doll, and it has the proper names for different kinds of garments. So, just take a look at this a little closer. I won't bother you with my terrible pronunciation of these things. But the belau is the garment that women wear. I'm going to get into that in a second. Mantle, another word for a cape, essentially. So just hit the guimple, right here it is. This is where sort of nuns ended up getting their habitry. This is the time period where we go back to sometimes to take some of our ceremonial garments. Certainly vestments come from this time period, but so do academic robes and regalia. It all sort of comes from this time period. So take a closer look at this because it's got actual real words for things that one might need to know. Here's another picture of the belau. So again, you can see it's sort of loosely fitting garment. Certainly has some seams going on, some things. Has this fantastic sleeve to it. This is also a hip belt. They would wrap fabric around their middle. Here's a male and a female belau. Get this from some statuary. And then we also, here's just another image of sort of some of the costume from the period. Let's talk about men a little bit. So we do actually start to get pants for the first time, trousers for the first time. For the most part, men are wearing hose still, but the influence of the Gauls, who did wear pants in the north, really started to influence that men started to wear pants in certain less formal situations. It was still less common in the south. In the south, they were still mostly draped garments, but the hose are sort of the intermediary period between men wearing pants and skirts. And at the end of the Crusades in the 13th century, new processes have been imported to Europe. People learned how to print on textiles from the Muslims, who learned it from the Coptic people of Egypt. There's different kinds of foods through trade. People learned a little bit more about medicine. There were new kinds of works of art and fabric that were brought back to Europe. And with fabrics, we had new and different kinds. Dimity, silk, damask, and cotton come back into use. There's increasing variety and types of dress, which creates some difficulty in terminology because of the fact that people in different areas were using different words. But here's some basic terms. The tabard, so this is essentially a piece of fabric, very simple, put over the shoulders, very similar to a tunic, but open on one side, or on both sides, and tied with a belt. This would go over other garments. Often this would be decorated with whoever the liege lord was, their colors or their crests or their decorations, or it would be your own house sort of information. This is a longer version of the tabard, the cyclas. And so you can see here that it just sort of goes down to the legs longer. In the 13th century, we start to get some a little bit more of a direct style. So here are some elbow sleeves, essentially, and a pendant belt. Here's a garnache. It's an outer layer, very loose, similar to a coat. Could be lined with fur for warmth. So that it's essentially just a different form of a cloak as well. Here is the Haragot. So this is again a different kind of cloak with a pointed hood. So now we're getting a hood specifically. We're getting these kinds of sleeves that have a slit in them. We have different layers going on underneath that. We have early pockets. So these are called fitchets. So the women would wear this outer tunic that was starting to get more and more elaborate. And then it would have these fitchets, these little pockets. It really was probably more of a hole that would go into some other area. They're just like a slit so she could reach inside and hide things inside of her garment. A hauberk is a shirt of mail. The term is usually used to describe a shirt reaching to at least mid-thigh and including sleeves. This is for protection, so chainmail protects you from getting stabbed. So this here is the chaperon. So here we have a very long pointed, I love hats from this period, they're so ridiculous. A long pointed hat. Here's a Florentine woman. So of course, these styles also varied throughout Europe, which is why I'm not spending too much time on it. It's all very, very different. You can see here that her the sleeves are slightly less important here. She has like a short sleeve on her outer tunic, and then the layers of her dress are differentiated. Here's an overview of some of the costuming of the period. Just take a closer look at this, and because it's a really simplified version of what we've been talking about.